Lieutenant Sarah Martinez stepped out of the black sedan that had brought her to Fort Brennan military base. The hot Texas sun beat down on her shoulders as she adjusted the simple civilian clothes she had chosen for her arrival. Her orders were clear. Observe the base operations for 48 hours before officially taking command. She wanted to see how things really worked when the soldiers thought no one important was watching. The base bustled with activity. Soldiers in camouflage uniforms moved between buildings, vehicles rumbled past, and the sound of training exercises echoed from the distant firing range. Sarah had spent the last 15 years working her way up through the ranks, earning her position as the youngest female general in the Army's history. At 38, she had commanded respect in war zones across 3 continents, but today she looked like any other civilian visitor. She pulled a small duffel bag from the car and walked toward the main entrance. The guard at the gate barely glanced at her visitor's pass before waving her through. Sarah made mental notes about the security procedures as she navigated the base layout. Her new position would begin officially on Monday morning, but she had arrived on Friday to get a feel for the place. The base commander, Colonel Harrison, had arranged for her to stay in the visiting officers' quarters. As she walked across the compound, Sarah noticed several soldiers gathered near the motor pool. Their loud voices and laughter carried across the dusty ground. "Look what we got here," called out Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, a stocky man in his mid-30s with arms covered in tattoos. "Another lost civilian wandering around our base." Sarah continued walking, her expression neutral. She had dealt with difficult soldiers before and knew how to handle herself, but she was curious to see how these men behaved when they thought no authority figures were present. "Hey, lady, you lost or something?" shouted Corporal Danny Walsh, a lanky redhead with a smirk plastered across his face. "This ain't a tourist attraction." Several other soldiers had joined the group now. Private First Class Rodriguez, Sergeant Kim, and Corporal Jackson all stood with their arms crossed, looking amused by the situation. Sarah recognized the type immediately. Soldiers who had gotten too comfortable and forgotten the discipline that should define military life. "I'm heading to the visiting quarters," Sarah said calmly, not breaking her stride. "Oh, she talks," Torres laughed. "What brings you to our little slice of paradise, sweetheart? You here to see your boyfriend?" The comment drew more laughter from the group. Sarah stopped walking and turned to face them. She had options here. She could reveal who she was and watch them scramble to attention. She could report them to their current commanding officer. Or she could use this as a learning opportunity to see exactly what kind of problems existed in the leadership structure of her new command. "I'm here on business," she replied simply. "Business?" Walsh stepped closer, his tone becoming more aggressive. "What kind of business does a little girl like you have on a military base?" Sarah noticed that no other soldiers or officers were intervening. Either they were too far away to hear what was happening, or they had grown accustomed to this kind of behavior. Both possibilities troubled her. "The kind that doesn't concern you, Corporal," she said, reading his rank from his uniform. Walsh's face reddened. He clearly didn't like being addressed by rank by someone he saw as a civilian. "Listen here, lady. You're on our turf now. Maybe you should show a little more respect to the people who keep this country safe." "Respect is earned," Sarah replied quietly. This only made the situation worse. Torres stepped forward now, his chest puffed out in an obvious attempt at intimidation. "You got a real mouth on you, don't you? Maybe someone needs to teach you how to talk to soldiers." Sarah's military training kicked in automatically. She assessed the tactical situation without conscious thought. 5 men, all younger and probably stronger, but none of them appeared to be in exceptional physical condition. They were positioned poorly for any real confrontation, bunched together instead of spread out. More importantly, they were letting emotion cloud their judgment. "Is there a problem here?" asked a new voice. Sarah turned to see a woman in uniform approaching. The name tape read Captain Williams, and Sarah could see the intelligence in her eyes that had been lacking in the men. "No problem, Captain," Torres said quickly, his demeanor changing immediately. "Just welcoming a visitor to our base." Captain Williams looked between Sarah and the group of men. Her expression suggested she wasn't buying Torres's explanation. "I see. And this welcoming committee, is it standard procedure?" "We were just making conversation, ma'am," Walsh added nervously. Sarah watched the interaction with interest. Captain Williams clearly commanded respect from these soldiers in a way their immediate supervisors apparently did not. She made another mental note. "I'm sure you were," Williams said dryly. "Don't you all have duties to attend to?" The group began to disperse, but Torres couldn't resist one final comment. "Welcome to Fort Brennan," he said to Sarah with false sweetness. "Hope you enjoy your stay." After the men had walked away, Captain Williams approached Sarah. "I apologize for that behavior. Those soldiers don't represent the standards of this base." "Thank you for intervening," Sarah said. "Does that sort of thing happen often?" Williams hesitated before answering. "More often than it should. There have been some leadership challenges lately. The base commander we're expecting next week should help address these issues." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "What kind of leader are you expecting?" "From what I've heard, someone who doesn't tolerate nonsense. General Martinez has a reputation for turning around problematic units. She's young for a general, but her record speaks for itself." Sarah managed to keep her expression neutral despite the irony of the situation. "She sounds impressive." "I hope so. This base needs someone who can restore proper discipline and respect. The way those soldiers just treated you would never have happened under proper command." As Captain Williams walked away, Sarah continued to her assigned quarters. The small room was clean but basic, with a narrow bed, a desk, and a window that overlooked the training grounds. She unpacked her few belongings and sat down to review her mental notes from the day. The incident at the motor pool was troubling but not surprising. In her experience, discipline problems like that were usually symptoms of larger leadership issues. Soldiers who felt comfortable harassing civilians on a military base had clearly not been properly supervised or corrected in the past. She opened her laptop and began typing a report to herself. Every detail mattered when it came to understanding the culture she would be inheriting. The soldiers involved in the harassment would need to be addressed, but more importantly, she needed to understand how the leadership structure had allowed such behavior to develop. As evening approached, Sarah decided to explore more of the base. She changed into workout clothes and headed to the gym. Physical fitness standards were often a good indicator of overall military discipline. If soldiers were allowed to slack off in one area, they usually slacked off in others too. The gym was moderately busy with soldiers finishing their daily workout requirements. Sarah found an available treadmill and began running at a steady pace. She could feel eyes on her, the same mixture of curiosity and judgment she had experienced earlier. After 30 minutes on the treadmill, she moved to the weight area. This was where she encountered Torres again. He was bench pressing with two of his friends, spotting him. When he saw her, his face twisted into an ugly grin. "Well, well, look who's still hanging around," he said loudly enough for others to hear. "Didn't get enough attention earlier?" Sarah ignored him and began her own workout routine. She had always been strong for her size, a necessity in her line of work. The weights she selected drew surprised looks from several nearby soldiers. "Show off," she heard someone mutter. Torres finished his set and walked over to where Sarah was doing pull-ups. "Trying to impress someone, sweetie?" Sarah completed her set before looking at him. "Just maintaining my fitness standards." "Your fitness standards?" Torres laughed. "What are you, some kind of weekend warrior? Play soldier on the weekends?" The conversation was attracting more attention now. Several soldiers had stopped their own workouts to watch what was happening. Sarah could see both amusement and discomfort on various faces around the gym. Something like that, Sarah said simply, moving to the next exercise in her routine. Torres wasn't done yet. You know what I think? I think you're one of those military groupies. Come around the base looking for a soldier boyfriend. That's why you're here, right? Sarah paused in her workout. The comment had crossed a line, and she could see that even some of Torres's friends looked uncomfortable now. But she was still curious to see how far this would go without intervention. I think you should focus on your own workout, she said calmly. Or what? Torres stepped closer, lowering his voice, but not enough to keep others from hearing. You gonna report me? To who? Nobody here cares what happens to some random civilian. This was the moment Sarah had to make a decision. The smart play would be to de-escalate and walk away. She could address Torres properly when she officially took command. But something in his tone suggested this wasn't just casual harassment. This was a man who felt entitled to intimidate anyone he perceived as vulnerable. I'm sure someone cares, Sarah said quietly. Torres laughed and looked around the gym. Who? Anyone here gonna defend this lady? His voice grew louder. Anyone think she doesn't deserve to be put in her place? The gym had gone quiet now. Every soldier present was watching the confrontation unfold. Sarah could see the conflict in many of their faces. They didn't like what Torres was doing, but they weren't willing to challenge him either. Captain Williams appeared in the doorway of the gym at that moment. Her eyes quickly assessed the situation, and her face darkened with anger. Staff Sergeant Torres, she called out sharply. A word, now. Torres's confident expression faltered. Captain, we were just... Now, Williams repeated, her voice carrying the authority of command. As Torres reluctantly walked toward the captain, Sarah finished her workout in peace. The other soldiers gradually returned to their routines, but she could feel the tension that remained in the air. Sarah gathered her things and headed back to her quarters. The day had been more revealing than she had expected. The problems at Fort Brennan ran deeper than simple discipline issues. There was a culture of intimidation that had been allowed to develop, and it was clear that good leaders like Captain Williams were fighting an uphill battle. In her room, Sarah continued her notes. Tomorrow would bring more opportunities to observe, but she had already seen enough to know that major changes would be needed. The soldiers who had harassed her today had no idea that their new commanding general had been taking notes on every word, every action, every failure of leadership that had allowed their behavior to continue unchecked. As she prepared for bed, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Monday morning was going to be very interesting indeed. Saturday morning arrived with the harsh sound of reveille echoing across Fort Brennan. Sarah had been awake for an hour already, a habit developed during her years in active combat zones. She dressed in fresh civilian clothes and made her way to the dining facility for breakfast, continuing her mission to observe the base culture without revealing her identity. The dining hall buzzed with weekend activity. Off-duty soldiers sat in groups, their conversations mixing complaints about duty schedules with plans for their free time. Sarah took a tray and joined the breakfast line, noting how the kitchen staff interacted with the soldiers. Respect and courtesy seemed to be the norm here, which gave her hope that the problems she had witnessed were not universal. She found an empty table near the window and began eating her breakfast while listening to the conversations around her. It was then that she noticed Torres and his group sitting 3 tables away. They were speaking loudly enough that their words carried clearly across the room. I'm telling you guys, something about that woman yesterday wasn't right, Torres was saying to Walsh and Rodriguez. She was too calm, you know, like she wasn't intimidated at all. Maybe she's just stupid, Walsh suggested with a laugh. Some civilians think they're tough until reality hits them. Rodriguez, who had been quieter during yesterday's incident, looked uncomfortable. I don't know, man. Captain Williams seemed pretty angry about the whole thing. Williams is always angry about something, Torres dismissed. She thinks she's hot stuff because she went to some fancy military academy. But she's still just a captain. Sarah continued eating, her expression neutral while she absorbed every word. The conversation revealed attitudes that went beyond simple harassment. These soldiers showed a fundamental lack of respect for the chain of command and military values. "Hey, there she is," Walsh suddenly announced, having spotted Sarah across the dining hall. "Our new friend." Sarah felt their attention focus on her but continued eating without acknowledgement. She had hoped to avoid another confrontation, but it seemed Torres wasn't willing to let things go. "Should we go say good morning?" Torres asked with false sweetness, already standing up from his table. "Maybe we should leave it alone," Rodriguez suggested quietly. "Williams already chewed you out yesterday." "Williams isn't here," Torres pointed out, scanning the dining hall to confirm the captain's absence. The three men walked over to Sarah's table and sat down without invitation. Their presence immediately changed the atmosphere around them, causing other soldiers to glance over with mixture of curiosity and concern. "Sleep well?" Torres asked with an exaggerated smile. "Hope our base accommodations met your civilian standards." Sarah looked up from her breakfast. "Fine, thank you." "You know, we've been thinking about you," Walsh added, leaning forward on his elbows. "We're real curious about what brings someone like you to our little corner of Texas." "I already told you." "Business." Torres laughed. "Come on now. You can tell us the truth. What kind of business? You selling something? Trying to get some kind of contract with the Army?" Sarah could see other soldiers watching the interaction now. Some looked away when she met their eyes, while others watched with open interest. None intervened. "Nothing that concerns you," Sarah replied calmly. "See, that's where you're wrong," Torres said, his tone becoming more serious. "Everything that happens on this base concerns us. We're responsible for security here. For all we know, you could be some kind of threat." The accusation was ridiculous, but Sarah recognized it as an escalation tactic. Torres was trying to justify his harassment by framing it as a security concern. "I have proper authorization to be here," Sarah stated simply. "Authorization from who?" Walsh demanded. "Who do you know that got you on this base?" Sarah considered her options. She could show them her temporary visitor's pass, which would only raise more questions. She could continue deflecting, which might escalate the situation further. Or she could give them enough rope to hang themselves with. "Someone with authority," she answered. Torres's face reddened at the vague response. "You think you're real smart, don't you? Think you can come onto our base and act like you're better than us?" "I think you should return to your breakfast," Sarah said calmly. "We're not done talking," Torres shot back. "See, the thing is, civilians like you don't understand how things work around here. This is our house and you're a guest. Guests should show respect." Sarah noticed that Sergeant First Class Peterson had entered the dining hall and was observing the situation from the food line. Unlike Captain Williams, Peterson didn't immediately intervene. Instead, he seemed content to watch how the situation developed. "I understand respect perfectly," Sarah replied. "I also understand that respect works both ways." Walsh snorted. "Respect works both ways? Lady, you haven't done anything to earn respect. You're just some random civilian who thinks she can waltz in here and act tough." "What exactly would I need to do to earn respect?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about their answer. The question seemed to catch Torres off guard. He had been expecting continued defiance, not a direct question about their expectations. "Well, for starters, you could show some appreciation for what we do," he said after a moment. "We're out here protecting your freedom, and you act like we're bothering you." Sarah considered this response. It revealed a mindset that expected gratitude and deference from civilians, as if military service automatically entitled someone to special treatment regardless of their behavior. "I appreciate military service," Sarah said carefully. "I have great respect for professional soldiers." "Professional soldiers?" Torres repeated. "What's that supposed to mean?" Soldiers who conduct themselves according to military standards of discipline and honor. The comment hit its mark. Walsh's face flushed with anger, and Torres's jaw tightened visibly. "You questioning our professionalism?" Torres asked dangerously. "I'm stating what I observe," Sarah replied evenly. The tension at the table had become palpable. Other conversations in the dining hall had stopped as more soldiers became aware of the confrontation developing at Sarah's table. Sergeant Peterson finally approached, but his intervention was half-hearted. "Everything okay over here?" "Fine, Sergeant," Torres answered quickly. "Just getting acquainted with our visitor." Peterson looked at Sarah. "Ma'am, these soldiers giving you any trouble?" Sarah met his eyes and saw something there that troubled her. Peterson wasn't asking because he was concerned about her welfare. He was asking because he wanted to know if there would be paperwork or complications. "No trouble," Sarah said simply. Peterson nodded and walked away, clearly relieved to avoid any involvement. Sarah made another mental note about the leadership problems at Fort Brennan. With Peterson gone, Torres leaned closer to Sarah. "Smart answer. See, you're learning how things work around here." "What am I learning exactly?" "You're learning that it's better to get along than to make waves. Soldiers stick together. We take care of our own. Outsiders who cause problems tend to find their stay uncomfortable." The threat was subtle but clear. Sarah had encountered similar intimidation tactics before, usually from soldiers who had forgotten that their oath was to serve and protect, not to bully and threaten. "Are you threatening me?" she asked quietly. Torres sat back with an innocent expression. "Threatening you? Of course not. I'm just explaining how military communities work. We're like a big family here. Families protect each other from outside interference." Walsh nodded agreement. "That's right. And families don't like it when strangers come around causing trouble or acting like they're better than everyone else." Sarah finished her breakfast and stood up to leave. "I think this conversation has run its course." "Already?" Torres asked with mock disappointment. "We were just getting to know each other." Sarah picked up her tray and walked toward the dish return. Behind her, she could hear Torres speaking loudly enough for half the dining hall to hear. "Some people just don't appreciate hospitality," he announced to no one in particular. As Sarah left the dining facility, she reflected on what she had learned. The problem at Fort Brennan wasn't just a few bad soldiers. It was a systematic failure of leadership that had allowed a culture of intimidation to develop. Soldiers like Torres felt entitled to harass anyone they perceived as vulnerable because they had never been properly corrected. She spent the rest of the morning walking around the base, observing training exercises and equipment maintenance. The quality of work varied significantly between different units. Some showed excellent military bearing and professionalism, while others displayed the same casual disregard for standards that she had witnessed in Torres and his group. Around noon, Sarah decided to visit the base library. She wanted to review the personnel files and recent incident reports, using her temporary access credentials to get a better picture of the command climate. The library was nearly empty, with only a few soldiers studying for advancement exams. Sarah found a computer terminal in a quiet corner and logged into the base network. Her security clearance gave her access to information that painted a troubling picture. Over the past 6 months, there had been 12 formal complaints filed against various soldiers at Fort Brennan. Most involved inappropriate conduct toward female personnel or civilian contractors. What concerned Sarah most was that only 2 of these complaints had resulted in any disciplinary action. She pulled up Torres's personnel file and found a record that confirmed her suspicions. He had received 3 written counseling statements in the past year for unprofessional behavior and failure to maintain military bearing. Despite this pattern, he had recently been recommended for promotion to Sergeant First Class. Walsh's record was similar, with multiple incidents that had been handled with minimal consequences. Rodriguez, on the other hand, had a clean record until recently. Sarah suspected he was being influenced by the others rather than being a natural troublemaker. As she reviewed more files, a pattern emerged. The previous base commander had left 6 months ago under circumstances that weren't detailed in the available records. Since then, the base had been operating under interim leadership that seemed reluctant to address disciplinary problems decisively. Finding what you're looking for? Sarah looked up to see Captain Williams standing beside her workstation. The captain's expression was curious but not suspicious. "Just doing some research," Sarah replied honestly. Williams glanced at the screen, which currently displayed the base organizational chart. "Thinking about joining the Army?" Sarah smiled. "Something like that. I'm trying to understand how this particular unit operates." "It's been a challenging few months," Williams admitted, settling into the chair beside Sarah. "We're between commanders, and some soldiers have taken that as an opportunity to test boundaries. The soldiers I encountered yesterday seemed very comfortable with testing boundaries." Williams sighed. "Torres and his group have been problems for a while. The previous commander was reluctant to take strong action, and the interim leadership has been inconsistent." "What kind of action is needed?" "Honest. A complete culture change, starting from the top and working down. Some soldiers need to be retrained, and others need to be transferred or discharged, but that requires leadership willing to make hard decisions." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "The new commander taking over Monday, do you think she'll be willing to make those decisions?" "I hope so," Williams said fervently. "From what I've heard, General Martinez has experience turning around problem units. She's supposedly very tough on discipline issues." "Supposedly?" "Well, I've never worked under her before. But her reputation suggests she doesn't tolerate the kind of behavior you experienced yesterday." Sarah closed the computer files she had been reviewing. "What would happen if someone filed a complaint about yesterday's incident?" Williams looked troubled. "Honestly? Probably not much. Torres would claim he was just being friendly, and without witnesses willing to contradict him, it becomes a he said, she said situation. Were there witnesses? Sure. But getting soldiers to testify against each other is difficult. Military units are tight-knit communities. People worry about being labeled troublemakers." Sarah understood the dynamic Williams was describing, but it frustrated her nonetheless. Military discipline depended on soldiers holding each other accountable, not protecting bad actors out of misguided loyalty. They were interrupted by the sound of raised voices from outside the library. Through the window, Sarah could see Torres and Walsh involved in what appeared to be a heated argument with 2 other soldiers she didn't recognize. "Excuse me," Williams said, standing up quickly. "I need to handle this." Sarah watched through the window as Captain Williams approached the group. The argument stopped immediately, but she could see the tension in everyone's body language. Williams spoke to each soldier individually, clearly giving instructions or corrections. After a few minutes, the group dispersed. Williams returned to the library looking frustrated. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked. "Just more of the same. Torres was harassing some new privates who arrived yesterday. He seems to think intimidating junior soldiers is some kind of sport." Sarah felt her anger rising. The pattern was clear now. Torres wasn't just a problem for civilians visiting the base. He was a systemic issue that was poisoning the entire command climate. Has anyone ever tried to transfer him? The previous commander initiated transfer paperwork twice, but both times it got tied up in bureaucratic delays. Torres has connections in the personnel office that seem to help him avoid consequences. Connections? His brother-in-law works in the regional headquarters. Every time discipline comes up, suddenly there are questions about proper procedures or missing documentation. Sarah made another mental note. Corruption and favoritism were cancers that could destroy military effectiveness if not aggressively treated. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah continued her observations around the base. She witnessed several more incidents that reinforced her growing understanding of the problems at Fort Brennan. Soldiers were comfortable ignoring regulations when it suited them, and leadership responses were inconsistent at best. By evening, she had compiled a comprehensive mental picture of what she would be inheriting as the new commanding general. The challenges were significant, but not insurmountable. What she needed was a clear plan for addressing the cultural problems while maintaining operational effectiveness. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah allowed herself to feel a sense of anticipation for Monday morning. Torres and his group had no idea what was coming. They had spent 2 days showing her exactly who they really were, and she had been taking careful notes the entire time. Monday's Reveille formation was going to mark the beginning of a new era at Fort Brennan. Monday morning at Fort Brennan dawned clear and crisp. Sarah Martinez woke at 04:30 hours, the same time she had awakened every day for the past 15 years of military service. Today was different, however. Today she would stop being an observer and become the commanding officer of Fort Brennan. She dressed carefully in her dress blue uniform, each ribbon and medal precisely positioned according to regulations. The silver star on her shoulder marked her rank as Brigadier General, the youngest woman ever to achieve that rank in the United States Army. Her uniform told the story of her career. Combat deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, specialized training schools, commendations for valor and leadership. At 05:30 hours, Sarah made her way to the base headquarters building. The charge of quarters saluted smartly as she approached, his eyes widening slightly as he noticed her rank. "General Martinez, ma'am. Welcome to Fort Brennan." "Thank you, Sergeant. Is Colonel Harrison available?" "Yes, ma'am. He's been expecting you. Right this way." Colonel Harrison, the interim base commander, greeted Sarah with obvious relief. He had been managing Fort Brennan for 6 months while waiting for a permanent replacement, and the strain was evident on his face. "General Martinez, it's an honor to finally meet you. I hope your weekend observations gave you a good sense of our operations here." Sarah accepted the offered coffee and took a seat across from Harrison's desk. "Very enlightening, Colonel. We'll need to discuss several issues after this morning's formation." "Of course, ma'am. The troops are assembled and waiting for your introduction." At 06:30 hours, Sarah stepped onto the platform overlooking the base parade ground. Below her, approximately 800 soldiers stood in formation, their uniforms crisp in the early morning light. She could see Torres, Walsh, and Rodriguez in the ranks, looking bored and slightly annoyed at the early formation. Colonel Harrison stepped to the microphone first. "Good morning, Fort Brennan." "Good morning, sir," the formation thundered back. "Today marks an important transition for our base. I'm honored to introduce your new commanding general, Brigadier General Sarah Martinez. General Martinez brings 15 years of distinguished service to Fort Brennan, including multiple combat deployments and a proven track record of excellence in leadership. General?" Sarah stepped forward to the microphone. In the formation below, she could see confusion beginning to spread across certain faces. Torres was squinting up at the platform, his expression shifting from boredom to uncertainty. "Good morning, soldiers of Fort Brennan," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly across the parade ground. "Good morning, ma'am," came the response, though she noticed it lacked the enthusiasm of the previous greeting. "Over the weekend, I had the opportunity to observe your base operations," Sarah continued. "I walked among you as a civilian visitor, watching how you conduct yourselves when you believe no one in authority is present." A murmur ran through the formation. Sarah could see Torres's face draining of color as the implications of her words began to sink in. "Some of what I observed filled me with pride. I saw soldiers maintaining high standards, treating others with respect, and demonstrating the professionalism that defines our Army." Sarah paused, letting her eyes sweep across the formation. "I also observed behaviors that fell far short of our standards. Soldiers who felt comfortable harassing civilians, who showed disrespect for the chain of command." and who demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to wear this uniform. The formation had gone completely silent now. Even the morning breeze seemed to have stopped. To those soldiers who conducted themselves with honor this weekend, thank you. You represent the best of what we aspire to be. Sarah's voice hardened slightly as she continued. To those soldiers who chose a different path, you should know that every word, every action, every failure of military bearing was noted and will be addressed. She could see Torres whispering urgently to Walsh, both men looking increasingly panicked. Rodriguez stood frozen, staring up at the platform in shock. Effective immediately, Fort Brennan will return to the standards of discipline and professionalism that define the United States Army. There will be no exceptions, no special considerations, and no tolerance for behavior that dishonors this uniform or intimidates those under our protection. Sarah stepped back from the microphone and nodded to Colonel Harrison, who dismissed the formation. As the soldiers began to file away, she could see heated conversations breaking out throughout the ranks. Word was spreading quickly about what had happened. 20 minutes later, there was a sharp knock on the headquarters conference room door. Captain Williams entered with Torres, Walsh, and Rodriguez in tow. All three men looked like they had seen a ghost. "Ma'am," Williams announced formally, "Staff Sergeant Torres requested to speak with you immediately." Sarah looked up from the stack of personnel files she had been reviewing. "Of course, please. Have a seat." Torres remained standing at attention, his face pale and sweating despite the cool morning air. "Ma'am, there seems to have been some kind of misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Sarah leaned back in her chair. "Please explain." "The incidents over the weekend, ma'am. We had no idea who you were. If you had known I was a general, you would have behaved differently." Torres nodded eagerly. "Yes, ma'am. Absolutely, ma'am. We would never have—" "I see," Sarah interrupted. "So your respectful treatment of visitors depends on their rank? Civilians don't deserve the same courtesy you would show a general?" Torres's mouth opened and closed without sound. Beside him, Walsh was staring at the floor, and Rodriguez looked like he might be sick. "Let me ask you something. Staff Sergeant Torres, what exactly did you think gave you the right to harass a civilian visitor to this base?" We weren't harassing anyone, ma'am. We were just being friendly." Sarah pulled out a notebook and flipped through several pages of handwritten notes. "Let me refresh your memory. Friday afternoon at the motor pool, you told me this was your turf and suggested I needed to show more respect. You called me sweetheart and little girl. You implied I was some kind of military groupie looking for a boyfriend." Torres's face had gone from pale to green. "Ma'am, I can explain." "I'm not finished," Sarah continued calmly. "Saturday morning in the dining facility, you sat at my table without invitation. You questioned my authorization to be on this base. You made veiled threats about outsiders who cause problems having uncomfortable stays." She flipped to another page in her notebook. "Saturday evening in the gym, you accused me of being a show-off and suggested I was trying to impress someone. You asked the entire gym if anyone would defend me, clearly hoping to isolate and intimidate me." Sarah closed the notebook and looked directly at Torres. "At what point in this behavior did you consider yourself to be representing the United States Army with honor?" Torres was trembling now. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I made a terrible mistake. If you give me another chance..." "Another chance?" Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Staff Sergeant, you've had chances. According to your personnel file, you've received 3 written counselings for similar behavior in the past year. Your pattern of conduct shows a complete disregard for military values and basic human decency." She turned to Walsh. "Corporal Walsh, you were an active participant in every incident. You called me sweetheart, questioned my business on this base, and made threatening statements about families protecting themselves from strangers." Walsh couldn't meet her eyes. "Ma'am, I was just following Sergeant Torres's lead. Following orders to harass civilians? I don't recall that being part of your military training. Sarah's attention shifted to Rodriguez. Private First Class Rodriguez, you participated in these incidents as well, but I noticed you seemed uncomfortable at times. Is there something you'd like to say? Rodriguez straightened slightly. Ma'am, I know there's no excuse for my behavior. What we did was wrong, whether you were a general or just a regular civilian. I'm ashamed of myself. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's the first honest thing anyone has said in this room. She stood up and walked to the window overlooking the parade ground where soldiers were going about their morning duties. Here's what's going to happen, she announced without turning around. Staff Sergeant Torres, you are relieved of all leadership responsibilities pending a formal investigation into your conduct. You will report to the base legal office this afternoon to discuss possible courts-martial proceedings. Torres staggered slightly. Ma'am, please. Corporal Walsh, you are reduced to the rank of private. You will attend mandatory counseling on appropriate conduct and respect. Any future incidents will result in your discharge from the Army. Sarah turned back to face the group. Private Rodriguez, you will also attend mandatory counseling, but I'm recommending you for transfer to a unit where you can learn proper military values without negative influences. She sat back down and opened a different folder. Captain Williams, these 3 soldiers are confined to barracks when not on duty pending completion of their disciplinary actions. They are not to interact with civilian visitors or new personnel without direct supervision. Yes, ma'am, Williams replied crisply. Sarah looked at the 3 soldiers one final time. You had the opportunity to represent your country with honor, and you chose instead to abuse your positions to intimidate someone you thought was powerless to respond. That is not just a failure of military discipline, it's a moral failure that has no place in our Army. As the 3 men were escorted out, Colonel Harrison remained behind. General, I should have addressed these issues sooner. I take full responsibility for allowing this culture to develop. Sarah nodded. We'll discuss systemic changes later, Colonel. Right now, I want a complete review of all disciplinary actions from the past year. Any cases where harassment or intimidation was involved need to be reopened. Yes, ma'am. What about the promotion list? Torres was scheduled to be promoted to Sergeant First Class next month. Remove his name immediately. In fact, I want to review all pending promotions for soldiers with disciplinary issues. Over the next several hours, word of the morning's events spread throughout Fort Brennan. Reactions varied dramatically. Some soldiers expressed relief that the problematic behavior they had witnessed was finally being addressed. Others worried about increased scrutiny and stricter enforcement of regulations. By afternoon, Sarah had conducted meetings with all of the senior leadership on the base. The message was clear. Military standards would be enforced consistently and fairly, regardless of rank or connections. Sergeant Peterson, who had failed to intervene during the dining hall incident, found himself reassigned to duties that didn't involve supervision of other soldiers. The personnel office was instructed that family connections would no longer influence disciplinary decisions. Captain Williams was promoted to major and given expanded responsibilities for enforcing standards throughout the base. Her intervention during Sarah's observation period had demonstrated the kind of leadership Fort Brennan needed. As the week progressed, the changes at Fort Brennan became apparent to everyone. Soldiers began treating civilian visitors with respect and courtesy. Equipment maintenance improved as troops realized that standards would be enforced across all areas of responsibility. Torres, meanwhile, faced a general court-martial for conduct unbecoming a soldier. His military career was effectively over, ended by his decision to harass someone he thought couldn't fight back. Walsh struggled with his demotion, but eventually began to understand the seriousness of his actions. The mandatory counseling helped him recognize how his behavior had violated the trust placed in him as a soldier. Rodriguez proved to be the success story Sarah had hoped for. Removed from negative influences and given proper mentorship, he demonstrated the potential that had led to his initial enlistment. His transfer to a new unit gave him the fresh start he needed. 6 months later, Fort Brennan had been transformed. Morale was higher, discipline was consistent, and soldiers took pride in their service rather than using their uniforms as excuses for bad behavior. Sarah often reflected on that weekend when she had walked among the soldiers as a civilian. It had been a painful but necessary lesson for everyone involved. The soldiers who had harassed her had learned that actions have consequences, regardless of who they think is watching. More importantly, the entire base had learned that true military leadership meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, not exploiting power for personal gratification. The harassment of a civilian visitor had ended when the soldiers discovered she was their new general. But the real change came when they learned that their behavior was wrong, regardless of her rank or position. That lesson, that every person deserves dignity and respect, became the foundation for everything else that followed. Fort Brennan was no longer just a military base where soldiers happened to be stationed. It had become a community where service members understood their responsibility to uphold the highest ideals of their profession, both in uniform and out, whether anyone was watching or not.